Okay, thank you very much. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I don't know where you're joining from. Here in Sydney it's evening, but I know in Europe it's just morning. And thank you very much for being here. And thank you to the Plamadiso team for inviting me here to present my research. So I'm a PhD student at Sydney Law School, and today my research is Human Dignity in the Age of AI, regulating hyper-personalized AI consumer interactions. I would like to begin with a very ordinary consumer. So I'm Italian, so let's give this consumer an Italian name. Let us call this consumer Anna. Let's imagine that Anna wakes up, she's wearing a smartwatch. The smartwatch is recording her sleep, her heart rate, and aspects of her physical activity. During breakfast, she checks on social media. On her way to work, she uses a navigation app. Let's imagine, I don't know, Google Maps. And she browses an online shop. Later, she speaks to an AI assistant and scrolls through a streaming platform. Each interaction Anna has appears separate and relatively harmless. But together, all these interactions may reveal when Anna is tired, what worries Anna, what attracts Anna's attention, what she can afford, what she wants other people to think about herself as a person, about her aspect, perhaps even what she's likely to want next. So now imagine that all this knowledge about Anna is used not simply to show Anna something relevant for her, but to identify the precise message, the precise moment, the precise design, and the precise emotion appeal that is most likely to make Anna purchase a product. So the questions are, at what point does hyperpersonalization, and I will introduce the concept of hyperpersonalization later. So at what point does hyperpersonalization become manipulation? And at what point does influencing a consumer cease to respect a consumer as a person? So those are the questions at the center of my research. So let me begin by clarifying what I mean when I talk about hyperpersonalization. Personalization is not a new concept. A local shopkeeper who remembers that a customer prefers a particular product is already personalized the service. Conventional digital personalization also uses information, I don't know, like previous purchases or broad demographic categories to recommend products. Hyperpersonalization, although, is different. It's different in its scale, granularity, in its speed, in its capacity to adapt. It is personalization, but personalization is by AI and big data, all this extensive consumer data. AI system indeed can process large and diverse data sets. They can detect correlations that would not be visible to a human observer, and they can adjust commercial practices to that particular person, sometimes in real time. The relevant data may come from consumers' online activity. Let's think about what the consumers may search online, what they click, how long they remain on a page, and look at particular content, what they abandon in a shopping basket, how they respond to previous messages. All this is data for the AI to process. It may also come from social media, location services, connected devices, and increasingly from technologies that accompany the consumer throughout their day. Let's think, for instance, about smartwatches. Smartwatches, as I said in the example about Anna, they can produce data about sleep, but they can also produce data about the movement of a person, about their heart rate, their exercise habits. And another example may involve smart glasses. They can mediate what the consumer sees and how the consumer encounters the surrounding environment. Of course, not every trader will possess every piece of this information about a consumer, but the technological direction is clear. Consumer profiles can become increasingly continuous, contextual, and intimate. So the result is not simply a better prediction of what a category of consumers might do. The result is the growing ability to predict how this particular consumer may respond to this particular intervention at this particular moment. So the advent of hyperpersonalization creates, of course, both opportunities and risks. The opportunities are easy to understand. Let's think about a business. If a business can understand consumers more accurately, they may offer products and services that correspond more closely to individual needs. And everybody of us wants to have recommendations, advertising, and a ranking of products that are more aligned to our needs. So because this actually simplify complex choices, this can improve accessibility for consumers with special needs. They can help consumers find suitable products more efficiently. Let's think about a consumer with a disability whose digital interface automatically adapts to their needs, or a consumer with shown a cheaper and more suitable product without having to compare hundreds of options. And nowadays we are cognitively overloaded by all the information we can find online. So in these circumstances, hyperpersonalization may enhance autonomy because it makes meaningful choice easier. However, the same capabilities, the same technologies can be used differently. The individualization of commercial practices gives traders an important form of asymmetric power. Traders may know far more about the consumer than the consumer knows about the trader's methods, and in some respects more than the consumer consciously know about themselves. Let's go again back to Anna. Anna repeatedly makes unnecessary purchases late at night, particularly after sleeping poorly. An adaptive system that identifies this pattern can use all this data against Anna or for Anna. It can learn which colors, countdowns, recommendations, or messages are most effective when she's tired. So her responses become new data, and that data is used to refine the next intervention. The system is not merely responding to a pre-existing preference. It may be testing, reinforcing, and potentially shaping the preference. Hyperpersonalization can consequently serve consumer, but can also steer consumers toward choices that maximize the profit of corporations at the expenses of consumers' well-being. It may create artificial urgency, amplify insecurities, or stimulate needs that do not reflect the consumer's genuine interest. So the same knowledge that makes an interaction relevant can also make influence unusually difficult to perceive and resist. So the core of my research regards what hyperpersonalization means for human dignity. Consumer markets have always involved influence. Advertising seeks to persuade, shops arrange products strategically to make us buy their products, and salespeople emphasize certain qualities. My argument is not that every attempt to influence a consumer violates dignity. Indeed, the concern arises when knowledge about a person is used to bypass or exploit a person's capacity for self-directed choice. So when the person is not capable anymore to be an autonomous agent. Indeed, in its most troubling form, hyperpersonalization can transform the trader into a puppeteer and the consumer into a puppet. So I use this image to capture an extreme asymmetry. One part can observe, test, and continuously refine the strings through which the other party behavior is influenced, while the person being influenced may not even be aware of these strings, may not even see these strings, may even not be capable of reacting against these strings. So every interaction then becomes valuable, not only because it may produce a sale, but because it generates information that improves the next attempt at influence. This is what I describe as the instrumentalization of the consumer. The consumer is treated primarily as a source of data, a behavioral target, a means of generating revenue, rather than a person whose own purposes deserve respect. The resulting problem concerns autonomy, because the conditions for reflective and conscious choice may be weakened. But it also concerns dignity. So returning to Anna, it's about questioning whether she is just clicking buy and whether the process leading to that purchasing choice treated her as a person with ends of their own, or merely as an opportunity to convert her actions into just profits without adequate regard concerning her status as a human being. So to develop the claim, I look at Kant's philosophy. Kant distinguishes between things that have a price and persons who possess dignity. Objects may be assigned market value, $50 for, I don't know, a very cheap iPhone, or they can be exchanged for something equivalent. I can exchange, I don't know, my AirPods for a bottle of water because I'm in the Sahara Desert. Persons, by contrast, possess an intrinsic worth that cannot be reduced to a price or replaced by an equivalent, if we want at least to respect human dignity. Because human beings are unique, as they possess an intrinsic and unconditional worth that inheres in person as such and that demands unconditional respect. This intrinsic and unconditional worth that is uniquely possessed by human beings is human dignity, and the respect for human dignity demands to treat persons as ends in themselves and merely as means to the ends of others. So I need to highlight the word merely, because the word merely is important. Social and economic life inevitably involves people serving one another purposes. A consumer helps sustain a business helps satisfy a consumer needs. That reciprocal use is not inherently objectionable. The dignity problem arises when one party's ends effectively displace the others, when the consumer's capacities, vulnerability, or emotions are deliberately used as instruments without adequate regard for the consumer's own interests and purposes. Let's return to Anna once again. So the question is not whether the trader profits from a purchase, because profit is a legitimate feature of markets. The question is whether that system is engaging with Anna as a person capable of pursuing her own needs, or whether the system is identifying features of Anna's inner life simply to make her more exploitable. On this basis, I propose that respect for human dignity can function as a normative benchmark for consumer markets. This does not require traders to become guardians of every aspect of consumer well-being. Consumers remain responsible agents. Businesses remain entitled to pursue profit. But commercial freedom should operate within a basic relational constraint. Consumers must be treated as persons of intrinsic worth, with adequate regard for their autonomy, interests, and genuine needs. So this changes the question that consumer law asks. A conventional inquiry focuses on whether the consumer received all the legally required information and whether the statement was technically accurate. But let's go and assess what dignity-based inquiry would ask. To ask something further, how was the consumer addressed? Was the information presented in a form that the consumer could generally use? Did the trader exploit knowledge of a vulnerability that the consumer could not reasonably defend against? Was the consumer's decision-making support, or was the consumer decision-making strategically weakened? The distinction is especially important in AI-mediated markets. A disclosure may be formally present, and yet all the information given to the consumer has been placed where the system predicts that the particular consumer will ignore the information. A recommendation may be factually defensible, and yet be timed to exploit a moment of emotional fragility. Dignity, therefore, moves the analysis beyond the mere presence of choice. A button labeled accept does not by itself establish meaningful autonomy. We must also examine the conditions under which the choice was made. This challenge becomes clearer when we compare mass-standardized markets with hyper-personalized markets. So in a mass-standardized market, the commercial practice is ordinarily designed for a group. Let's think about, I don't know, television viewers or young adults or parents or children, people interested in a particular product. So the unit of influence is, broadly speaking, the average member of the target group. In hyper-personalized market, the unit of influence becomes increasingly the individual consumer. The message timing sequence, interface, the price presentation, the choice architecture may be tailored to that person's inferred characteristic. The practice can also change over time. Anna's reaction to yesterday's message informs today's message. Everything is data, everything is commodified, everything is processed by the AI. Whether Anna opened the message, hesitated, returned later to the message, or completed the purchase becomes part of an ongoing feedback loop. So hyper-personalization is pervasive in two senses. First, it can draw on information from multiple dimensions of life, browsing behavior, location, bodily signal attracted, for instance, by smartwatch, consumption history, and inferred emotional state. Second, it can operate throughout the consumer journey. Before the contract, it can shape advertising and recommendation. At the point of contracting, can shape rankings, defaults, interface design, contractual presentation, and the choice environment. After the contract, it can inform retention strategies, renewal prompts, customer service, attempts to induce further purchases. So the market is not simply observing the consumer from a distance. The market is accompanying the consumer, learning from the consumer, continuously adapting around the consumer. That is where the dignity concern becomes acute. Because the closer commercial system moves towards the consumer's inner words, the greater the risk that insights becomes intrusions and assistance becomes exploitation. So it is important to emphasize that hyperpersonalization is not inherently wrong. The legal and ethical character of the practice depends on how this enhanced power is used. We can imagine two systems possessing exactly the same knowledge about Anna. The first system recognizes that Anna tends to make impulsive purchases late at night. It responds by making total cost especially clear, removing unnecessary urgency, and allowing Anna to save the product and reconsider the product the following morning. This particular system is using hyperpersonalization to reduce information and cognitive burdens and to protect Anna from Anna's own vulnerabilities and susceptibilities. The second system identifies the same susceptibilities but uses these susceptibilities to intensify pressure. It sends an expiring offer the moment Anna is most fatigued, highlights social approval, hides the total cost behind installments, and repeats the message because previous data show that persists and eventually works. So we looked at a consumer-centric application of hyperpersonalization and then a trader-centric application of hyperpersonalization. So technological capacity is the same, the objectives the technology pursues and the material outcomes it produces can be different. When hyperpersonalization identifies genuine needs, improves accessibility, protects against foreseeable vulnerabilities, and supports considerate choice, it may be consumer-centric and compatible with dignity. When it exploits vulnerabilities or emotional states to steer consumers towards choices that principally serve the trader, hyperpersonalization is treating consumer merely as means for the maximization of corporate profits without adequate regard to their status as persons. So my research in particular focuses on the EU jurisdiction. And in the European Union, human dignity is recognized as a fundamental right by Article 1 of the Charter of the Fundamental Rights of the European Union. Article 2 of the Treaty of the European Union lists human dignity among the founding values of the European Union. UK's law, let's think about Omega, recognizes human dignity as a general principle of European Union law. On the other hand, Article 38 of the Charter sets that union policies shall ensure high level of consumer protection. Article 169 of the Treaty on the Function of the European Union identifies consumer protection as an objective of European Union action. This objective in particular must take account of scientific and technological developments to comply with Article 114 of the TFEU. So let's read together this provision. They establish an important orientation. So consumer law cannot remain indifferent when technological change fundamentally alters the power relationship between traders and consumer. Indeed, AI and big data can give traders an enhanced capacity to infer vulnerabilities, predict behaviors, test intervention, and act upon individual susceptibilities. A commitment to a high level of consumer protection must therefore respond not only to new products, but also to new forms of commercial power. Together, the relevance at the EU level of both the respect for human dignity and the objective of ensuring a high level of consumer protection require markets, and consequently traders, to treat and respect consumers both as an economic agents, but also as human beings. Consumer law has often protected the consumer as an economic decision maker. Looks at them like someone who needs accurate information, competitive prices, the freedom of choosing to choose between products. And these objectives, of course, remain essential. But The consumer is not merely a point of demand in the market. The consumer is also a human being whose autonomy, vulnerability, identity, and capacity for self-directed choice may be affected by commercial practices. This means that autonomy cannot be reduced to the existence of several clickable options. Freedom of choice must include reasonable conditions for conscious and self-directed decision-making. The consumer must be capable of being an autonomous decision-maker. So it also means that knowledge about consumers should not be treated as ethically neutral simply because it was lawfully collected. The question of whether data may be processed is not identical to the question of how the power generated by that data may be exercised. A trader indeed may comply with a disclosure obligation and still design the surrounding interaction to make that disclosure ineffective. A system may accurately infer that the person is lonely or anxious or fatigued and still act wrongfully by turning that insight into a point of commercial pressure. Commercial practices should therefore respect consumers both as economic agents and as human beings. They should not reduce people to data sources, behavioral profiles, and mere objects of optimization. My research therefore adopts a dignity-based reading of European Union consumer law with the aim of preserving a dual rationale to ensure market integrity while at the same time to protect consumers as human beings. Within this framework, human dignity operates principally as a prohibition on instrumentalization. So commercial practices must engage consumers as persons with ends of their own, rather than merely to use them merely as means to corporate profits. So this principle is necessarily general. Its legal value depends on whether it can inform the interpretation of existing rules. And that's why I looked at Unfair Commercial Practice Directive. The question is whether the framework can adequately protect a consumer like Anna when the practice confronting Anna has been designed for Anna alone. My examination of the Unfair Commercial Practice Directive identifies two principal limitations. So the first limit concerns the consumer benchmark, the average consumer, which works as the default benchmark, and the vulnerable consumer that represents the exception. The directive ordinarily evaluates a practice from the perspective of the average consumer, understood as a reasonably well-informed, reasonably observant, and circumspect. The directive also recognizes vulnerable consumer. Vulnerability is expressly linked to specific groups of consumers who are particularly vulnerable because of mental or physical infirmity, age, or credulity, where the trader could reasonably be expected to foresee that vulnerability. This architecture presents vulnerability as exceptional, something affecting identifiable groups that depart from the ordinary consumer. Digital market, however, challenge that assumption. Indeed, vulnerability may be situational. A person may be unusually susceptible because they are grieving, because they are exhausted, because they are financially distressed, socially isolated, under intense time pressure. It may be temporary, contextual, and invisible to other people. Most importantly, an AI system may detect that vulnerability even when the consumer cannot identify this vulnerability about themselves or articulate this vulnerability. The AI system may also deepen vulnerability by repeatedly exposing the consumer to carefully selected stimuli or by structuring the environment in ways that increase dependency, urgency, or emotional pressure. Anna is not simply or necessarily a vulnerable consumer in every aspect of her life. Anna may be highly educated, for instance. She can be very careful, digitally experienced. However, let's think that Anna is at 1 a.m. After a difficult day and little sleep, she may be predictably susceptible to a particular peer. In AI-driven markets, vulnerability may therefore be ordinary, situational, dynamically produced, not merely an exceptional characteristic of a predefined group of consumers. So let's look at the second limitation. The second limitation lies in the design of the directive itself. The Unfair Commercial Practice Directive was conceived principally with mass-standardised commercial practices in mind. Its average consumer benchmark makes intuitive sense when the same advertisement, sales technique, or representation is directed towards a reasonably identifiable group. But what happens when the practice is tailored to one specific person? So in this case, two difficulties arise. First, it may be difficult to identify a meaningful group of consumers exposed to the same practice. Anna may be receiving a particular combination of wording, imagery, timing, ranking, interface design because of a unique profile. Another consumer, I don't know, Mario, normally receiving the same offer may encounter a materially different practice. Second, even if a relevant group can be constructed, the consumer protection challenge may remain in the difference between the average member of that group and the individual consumer targeted by that practice. Suppose, for example, that the average member of the group will resist a countdown message, but Anna was targeted precisely because the system predicted she will not. Assessing the practice against the average may erase the individual susceptibility that the trader intentionally selected. Indeed, a consumer protection gap could lie in the difference in terms of vulnerabilities and susceptibilities between the material subject of the influence, so Anna, the individual consumer that has been materially targeted, and the average member of that identified group. This implies that the more precisely a practice is adapted to the individual, the less meaningful it becomes to ask how an average member of a group would respond. So the more individualized and precise the influence, the less adequate a group-based benchmark becomes. So the argument advanced in my research is that the limit of the Unfair Commercial Practice Directive do not only concern its benchmark or its group-based assessment of unfairness, they also concern how unfairness is interpreted. So I look at Article 5 of the Unfair Commercial Practice Directive. A commercial practice is unfair when two conditions are satisfied. It must be contrary to the requirements of professional diligence. It must materially distort or be likely to materially distort the economic behavior of the average member, the average consumer, with it reaches to whom it is addressed. In particular, the directive defines professional diligence by reference to the standards of special skill and care that a trader may reasonably be expected to exercise, commensurate with honest market practices and or good faith. So let's read these through the lens of human dignity. That standard should then include a duty to treat consumers as human beings whose autonomy and legitimate interests deserve respect. This would contextualize professional diligence within technological environments where traders may possess unprecedented knowledge about the persons they seek to influence. If commercial power changes, the demands of professional conduct cannot remain static. A trader capable of identifying individuals' vulnerability with great precision, in my opinion, should bear responsibilities corresponding to that capability. Professional diligence can therefore operate as a corrective within an increasingly asymmetric relationship. At the minimum, traders should not use intimate or inferential knowledge about consumers to undermine consumers' autonomy by exploiting behavioral patterns, cognitive limitation, or emotional states that concern consumer. More positively, where a system can foresee a serious risk to the consumer, professional diligence may require design choices that mitigate this risk rather than intensify the risk. This means that traders behaving in a way that respects human dignity should not transform superior knowledge of the consumer into a mechanism for exploiting that consumer. The standard of professional diligence should also be sensitive to the trader's actual capacity, because a generic advertisement based on limited information does not create the same responsibility as a system that continuously learns which intervention is most effective for a specific person like Anna. This produces a central proposition of my research, which is the more precise, the more individualized the influence becomes, the more demanding professional diligence should become. So I therefore interpret professional diligence as incorporating a prohibition on instrumentalization. To comply with this duty, traders cannot deploy hyper-personalized influence merely to monetize a consumer's vulnerabilities without adequate consideration of the consumer autonomy, well-being, and genuine needs. A trader is entitled, of course, to pursue profits and to persuade consumers. So what dignity excludes is a form of influence in which the consumer humanity becomes no more than raw material of optimization. Suppose again that we have an AI system, and this AI system knows Anna, and in particular knows that Anna is concerned about her appearance, how she looks like in front of other people. So a respectful practice might provide relevant, accurate information and allow Anna to evaluate a product without artificial pressure. We can also have an instrumentalizing practice. And this kind of practice might repeatedly intensify that insecurity that Anna has about her appearance and imply that social acceptance depends on purchasing that particular product. And the system can adapt the message until this cognitive resistance is overcome. So the difference is not captured completely by asking whether each sentence is literally true. It concerns the relationships constructed through the practice, whether the consumer is addressed as a deliberating person or managed as a predictable collection of susceptibilities. Therefore, professional diligence understood through dignity can bring that relational dimension to the legal assessment. Consequently, I provide a human dignity-oriented reading of the Unfair Commercial Practice Directive's prohibition. So, long story short, actions are interpreted as misleading under Article 6 when hyper-personalized influence is tailored to make the individual consumer perceive a determined choice as serving their interest when it actually does not. For example, Anna may be shown a subscription, and the way it is shown is like the best choice for Anna, the best choice for you. Because the system knows that personalized language, in the case of Anna, increase Anna's trust, even though cheaper options better reflect her actual usage. Similarly, omissions are considered misleading under Article 7 when information, even if given, is provided in a way that is made cognitively invisible for the individual consumer. So my interpretation, this dignity-oriented interpretation, is not a formal interpretation, it's a substantial interpretation. Examines not only what information appears on the screen, but how personalized design affects the consumer's realistic capacity to perceive and use that information. So hyperpersonalization may also constitute an aggressive commercial practice where it operates as undue influence. Under the Unfair Commercial Practice Directive, undue influence involves exploiting a position of power in relation to the consumer so as to apply pressure, even without physical force, in a way that significantly limits the consumer's ability to make an informed decision. This language is particularly relevant to AI-mediated influence. Data-driven knowledge and control over the digital choice environment may place the trader in an enhanced position of power, even when the interface remains friendly and no explicit threat is made. So the assessment should consider several dimensions. There are 4 dimensions. First is timing. Was the practice deployed at a moment of fatigue, urgency, stress, loneliness, or emotional fragility? Second is location. Did the trader control a hyper-personalized digital environment in which options, defaults, ranking, and frictions were arranged around the individual consumer? Third, nature and intensity. How granular was the knowledge used? And how strongly was the message adapted to the person's susceptibilities? The fourth element is a persistence. Was this a single communication, or was it part of an ongoing sequence learning from the consumer resistance and adjusting until that resistance is weakened? So let's return to Anna once more. A generic reminder that a sale ends tomorrow is an ordinary commercial persuasion. But a stream of individually optimized prompts delivered when the system detects that Anna is very fatigued or framed around an inferred insecurity, for instance, her appearance, intensified after each hesitation, is qualitatively different. The pressure may be invisible precisely because it feels personal, convenient, and responsive. That does not make it less capable of limiting informed choice. Instead, it is very powerful. A dignity-oriented interpretation can strengthen the Unfair Commercial Practice Directive, at least this is my opinion. But interpretational law cannot solve every problem. The directive operates primarily after or in response to a commercial practice. Hyper-personalized influence, however, might be extremely difficult to perceive, to reconstruct, to prove. Anna may see only her own interface. She cannot easily compare it with what other consumers saw, with what Mario saw. She may not know which data informed the message, which vulnerability was inferred about her, which alternative design the system, the AI system withheld. The most relevant evidence, the truth is, they may lie within proprietary model, experimentation system, data sets that are controlled by the trader, not by Hannah. There is therefore a significant enforcement problem. A right that depends upon the consumer recognizing an invisible form of manipulation may offer too little protection too late. That's why AI regulation may play a role as an anticipatory ex-ante form of consumer protection, impeding manipulative forms of AI-powered commercial practices to be deployed and ensuring that AI systems serve rather than exploit human beings. So let me conclude this talk by returning to Anna. She accompanied us during this journey. Nothing in her day appeared extraordinary. She was a very common consumer. She used familiar devices, they can be an iPhone, they can be a smartwatch. She encountered convenient recommendations. She made choices through interface designed to feel effortless. It's very easy to click and purchase something on the internet. Yet behind that ordinary experience of Anna may lie an extraordinary concentration on knowledge and influence. The central claim of my research is not that AI is inherently hostile to dignity or that hyperpersonalization should be prohibited. Of course not, because hyperpersonalization has a lot of benefits. They can offer a lot of benefits to consumers, may help consumers, may reduce complexity, may improve accessibility, may align markets more closely with individual needs. But the same capacity may be used to identify, test, and exploit vulnerabilities with a degree of precision that existing consumer law was not designed to confront. Human dignity provides a foundation for distinguishing assistance from instrumentalization. It reminds us that the consumer is not merely an economic variable, a data source, or a behavioral target. The consumer is a person with autonomy, vulnerability, interest, and ends of their own. Is and should be an autonomous agent throughout his consumer journey. For the Unfair Commercial Practice Directive, this produces a two-link conclusion. First, as I already said, the more individualized and precise the influence, the less adequate a group-based benchmark becomes. Second, the more individualized and precise the influence, the more demanding the trader's professional diligence should become. A commercial practice should therefore be considered unfair when it uses hyper-personalized power to instrumentalize the consumer. The challenge for consumer law in the age of AI is not simply to preserve the appearance of choice, it is to preserve the person who chooses. So thank you very much for your attention, for being here and listening to me. I'm very much looking forward to each and every single of your questions.